AJ, I'm just DoneJS. Just DoneJS. And I'm leaving because I can JS. This episode is sponsored by Front-End Masters. They have a terrific lineup of live courses you can attend either online or in person. They also have a terrific backlog of courses you can watch, including JavaScript the Good Parts, Build Web Applications with Node.js, AngularJS in Depth, and Advanced JavaScript. You can go check them out at frontendmasters.com. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary offer of $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they also give you a $1,000 bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the JavaScript Jabber link, you'll get a $2,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at hired.com/JavaScriptJabber. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code JavaScriptJabber, you'll get a $10 credit. Let's face it, bookkeeping is hard, and it's not really what you're good at anyway. Bench.co is the online bookkeeping service that pairs you with a team of dedicated bookkeepers who use simple, elegant software to do your bookkeeping for you. Check it out at bench.co/JavaScriptJabber for 20% off today. They focus on what matters most, and that's why they're there. Once again, that's bench.co/JavaScriptJabber. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 202 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from the snowy sunshine of Pleasant Grove.
Amy Knight.
Hello.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv. Quick shout out for React Remote Conf coming up here in about 3 months. We also have a special guest this week, and that is Justin Meyer.
Hey everybody, very happy to be here.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of Bitovi, a JavaScript consulting company. We've been around for 8 years. I'm the lead author of JavaScript MVC, which was a library of Node, framework of Node, it was built 8 years ago, probably peaked 6 years ago. And then I built CanJS and now released DoneJS and SteelJS and a bunch of other libraries that you may or may not have heard of.
So you want to give us a brief overview of what these are?
Yeah, so kind of the history of that would be I left Accenture like 8 years ago because I was disillusioned there with just how that kind of consulting operation worked. I felt that their business model didn't work very well, and I wanted to do something where it was, I would say, more people were actually developers, were most of the people working on a project. So I started a JavaScript consulting company because I'd done a little bit of JavaScript work with a friend of mine. And back then, this was, 8 years ago, there was really nothing. It was really easy, perfect time to start doing JavaScript consulting and building frameworks and tools and things like that because nothing existed. Built the parts of JavaScript MVC while working on this big T-Mobile application, and then just started doing consulting around that. So JavaScript MVC is basically what everybody uses now. It was dependency management, build systems. It was MVC, which is nobody does anymore, but templates and models and views. And then testing and stuff like that baked in and documentation engine. Anyway, so I built CanJS so we built JavaScript MVC. And then JavaScript MVC wasn't taking off really because Backbone had been released and Backbone was really small. And I think a lot of people wanted something smaller. It was too much to take on all of these dependency management and all of these tools that you just wanted something simple that would work for a small application because I don't think people were building a lot of big apps back then. So we extracted the MV star parts out of JavaScript MVC and released them as kind of a standalone package, which was CanJS. And then since that time, we've been upgrading and maintaining CanJS. We also split out the dependency management parts and the testing parts and the documentation parts all into individual libraries, and have been maintaining those for 4 years now. And then about 2 years ago, we decided to kind of get the gang back together again and rebuild what was kind of JavaScript MVC, but JavaScript MVC was built in Rhino because that was the only JavaScript interpreter at the time that would run on the server, or like the most popular one. We rebuilt it all in Node and upgraded and added a bunch of new features. And then the result is now DoneJS, which comprises of CanJS, SteelJS, FuncUnit for testing, and DocumentJS for documentation. And then it has a bunch of other little sub-libraries that solve different problems like server-side rendering.
I guess my question was, because I'm big on making comparisons since there's so many things out there right now. And for people like me who are not as versed in all the different options, immediately it came to mind, like, how is this different than Meteor? So maybe before we go too much further, you could kind of compare it to that.
So I think it's similar to Meteor, except that it runs off of any backend, right? You can, as long as you're making RESTful services, and even if you're not, it really doesn't care too much what you're doing on the backend. But then feature-wise, it's very similar. It still has real time, but it uses a technique very dissimilar to what Meteor does. It doesn't have a database on the client, and it doesn't assume a certain database or kind of backend. Instead, it uses what we kind of call set algebra to be able to do real-time updates of the list that the site knows it is loaded. So Meteor is probably what it's closest to. I would just say I said this actually at the Utah JS meetup the other day, is that if I'm trying to be as intellectually honest as possible, I think if your backend can be written in kind of Node, and you can want to build off what the Meteor expects in the backend, Meteor is probably the more appropriate solution. But you want to be writing Python or .NET on the back end, I think that DoneJS would make your life a little easier. I'm not even sure how possible it is to do that in Meteor, but it seems like it's not super easy.
Cool. I love honesty. It's good.
So to me, that sounded kind of like it's similar to React in being smart and similar to Angular in being a front end. And I'm not really familiar with Meteor. I didn't like it when I tried it. So I need a different comparison to make me feel better about this. So aside from Meteor, what is it like?
Okay, so I listened to the tools fatigue episode, and people were talking. You guys were all talking about the problems of how long it takes to set up a JavaScript application. What DoneJS does very well, and I think Meteor helps with, and Ember helps with, is that it sets up server-side rendering, real-time behavior, dependency management with ES6 and hot module swapping and high-performance builds and all of the stuff that you really want and should be doing, testing built in, documentation built in. It has all of those things ready to go right away when you kind of initialize an application. So in that way, it's similar to Meteor. But when you say React is smart, I'm not sure what you mean by smart. If you mean like it only updates, React's real thing is the virtual DOM diffing and things that kind of derive from that as a technology. It doesn't use virtual DOM diffing, but it uses observables, and I can go all into the difference between where I think observables are more applicable and the benefits and disadvantages of observables versus diffing in terms of technology. But I guess I need to know what you mean by React is smart.
That's what I meant. Well, as far as I know, I mean, people talk about React like it's a framework, but it's really just a view. So
yeah,
it's the real-time-iness that it enables is the diffing and the being intelligent about not wasting, like something can happen and it can update the page and the page can update, rather than like with Angular, if you do it in a very naive way instead of doing it the Angular way, then you can end up actually waiting for a list to load.
Yeah, so those things are all solved in CanJS. When I say, but to be specific here, I talk about real time, React really doesn't help you with when I'm talking about real-time behavior. When you want to say, hey, if this person makes changes on this page, how are we going to communicate those changes to another page so it updates correctly? You have to set up all of that plumbing yourself in something like React. Where CanJS, it's kind of more baked in for you. It's baked in, and I think this is actually one of the coolest parts of it, is it's, when I was talking about it's set algebra. If you
sounds cool. I want to hear more about that in a minute.
The set algebra, it is a cool sounding word. So, sets like Venn diagrams?
Mm-hmm.
I love those.
Yeah, those are great. When you request your data from a service layer, let's say, of course, a list of to-dos. You want a list of to-dos that are, let's say, due today. Well, you're requesting a subset of to-dos. Your parameters to the request might look like, slash to-dos, question mark, due equals today. But that represents a subset. And what we can do is say that, by knowing that the person requested to-dos due today, as long as we're getting messages when to-dos are being created, we know if the to-do being created belongs in that set of to-dos, or if to-dos are being updated, if they're moving in and out of that set of to-dos that are due today. And we can basically update the list that the client has loaded. So the client's loaded a list of to-dos that are due today, and we can basically add and remove things to that list using set logic. And you could create your own set logics that handle, things like sorting and ranges and that kind of thing. So you don't have to have kind of like a database in the client, and you don't have to have special, live query or something. You don't have to have any of that. You just have to have basic RESTful services. Just somehow your server just has to send these updated, created, destroyed messages to DoneJS, and it takes care of updating everything for you.
I like
Hopefully
it.
that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes sense. I appreciate the explanation. And just so you know, while I'm on the show, you can go as computer sciencey as you want, because I'll make the listeners enjoy it with my mind.
Awesome. I can go very computer. Good. I like that. I would love to go computer sciencey.
You just have to stop and answer Amy's questions.
Yes, I enjoy it too, but yeah, you might have to answer questions along the way. I'm Googling as you talk.
Here's the thing is, we've kind of gone a little bit deep into the weeds as far as how DoneJS does its thing. But what I'm really curious about is, let's say that I am Joe Programmer. I'm reasonably new to the whole front-end framework kind of area.
Hey, I'm Joe Programmer.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to be Joe Programmer for a minute anyway. But I guess the question is, how do I get started with DoneJS? I look at it, I see the benefits, and I'm like, you know what? This really looks like what I want. So how do you get started with an application? And how do you build your app from there? How do you architect it so that it lines up with kind of the DoneJS way?
Great question. So there's two on the DoneJS website. There's two guides. We have a very basic guide that's building the real-time chat app, the Hello World, and it's built with all the performance, flashy features that DoneJS provides, and you can export it to a native desktop app and through NWJS, and you can export it through an iOS app, through Cordova. That's really a fun one. But we also have a restaurant ordering guide called Place My Order, and that's a much more comprehensive guide that walks you through how it's built architecturally, how to set up routing, and then what I really like about it is it shows you how to set up tests with continuous integration, continuous deployment through Travis and through Heroku, and sets up things like content, uses a CDN. So that shows you how to more or less architect it and how to make it work in kind of a development ecosystem. Yes, NWJS is Node WebKit. And then I would say to follow that up, it's really about, once you're kind of set up with the DoneJS is mostly it's a super framework, but most of the meat of what you're building is actually CanJS. And then CanJS has a lot more docs and guides and things like that. Architecturally, it's MVVM is the architecture. And this is what I really like about it is how, well, I would say that there's two things to care about. One is what we call modlets. This is something that I've been big on for 8 years. And every time I give a talk, which isn't very often, there's one thing to kind of learn, I think, from how Bitovi develops. It's the modlet folder organization, where if you're working on a module, all of its tests, styles, documentation, and a demo page, and all code for it are in one folder. I really disagree with the approach where sometimes people have like a test folder separated from where their actual code that's being tested is. We like to make it so that everything works in one folder. You can write that module, test it, see it working in a demo page, separate out from the rest of the application. So that's how everything is organized in a DoneJS application. And then it's MVVM. So everything's you're building custom elements that are controlled by a view model. An observable is the view model. And when it changes, the template automatically updates itself to reflect those changes. So yeah, Charles,
I put in the chat, I just have this distaste for certain terms like webinar. Like it's a horrible word. And then I recently heard micronar, and modlet is right up there. I'm sorry. The name just kind of makes me go, ugh. But
I loved it, Justin. I loved it. I got you back,
thank
bro.
you, AJ. Well, if you don't like the term, hopefully I can convince you on the practice. Because for us, we build a lot of big systems. And if you have a lot of developers cranking on code, you don't want to have to load the entire application to see your widget. And I actually think it helps people design better modules if they're building it so that module they can actually make a demo page for it, a test separated from the rest of the app.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of components in React or in Angular 2. And, it makes sense. I mean, you have sort of an encapsulated section of functionality that you then manage through whatever other means you're using to pass messages around on your front end. So, I mean, I like the concept. I just hate the word.
I think the difference is when I'm talking about modlets isn't necessarily like how you build stuff. It's actually how you organize your files.
Okay.
You have a folder, and then the test for that module is in that folder, and the test for that module is in that same folder.
So couldn't we just call it an NPM module and be done with it?
You could break out your entire application into all of its own NPM modules if you wanted to maintain all of that and have individual tests and things like that and set up the continuous integration on each one of those.
Well, that would be a modlet, right? I mean, like by definition that we're talking about, that's a modlet. That's what NPM does. Or, well, it's what the GitHub plus NPM pop culture push is.
I can agree, but that's actually the highest form of modlet, actually, where if you were building your entire application where every single module was published to NPM or your local NPM and had its own tests and its own CI, that would be, I've never done it that way. That's intense because you just have a lot of like a boilerplate to be setting up. This is actually something that DoneJS can help with. Even if you were working on a non-CanJS based app and you were, hey, I want to make a React plugin, but you wanted to make sure Travis was set up easily and the tests would run automatically and it would be exported to every single format, AMD, CommonJS, so that people could share it really easy and publish it to NPM. DoneJS has like a plugin generator that helps with that kind of stuff. But I know of no project that you'd be talking about, if you have hundreds of files, you'd be talking about hundreds of different projects, all published to NPM. I just think it's unlikely that someone would actually go to that extreme.
So I guess my other question is then, where does can end and done begin, or vice versa? So is can this modular system, or is that a different piece altogether?
So yeah, let me break it down a little bit. CanJS is the MVVM parts.
Okay.
So it's closest to that. You would compare CanJS to something like Angular or React.
Okay.
Can we just clarify MVVM real quick?
Absolutely. It's a model, view model. And what I mean by that is it has models that help you get data from the server, typically connecting to a RESTful interface.
So REST JSON, one part.
Yes. And then kind of there's two parts to a model, really. There's getting your data and then actually the modeling part where you convert it to some type of type where I don't want just raw to-dos to come back from the server because it's nice if I have methods on them, can put helper functions. That's what it's kind of like Backbone's model and CanJS's model are very similar. It has the view part, which is, it's actually got two different real time, or I think when AJ was saying real time, live updating views. So if you change an observable, the template changes automatically, or what's rendered into the DOM is changed automatically.
Hey,
so
now when you say observable, do you mean like the RxJS observables, or are you talking about like a more classic definition of observable?
When we're talking about a classic form of observable, then kind of the event stream type observable. CanJS has this thing called computes, which you might have seen in something like Ember or Knockout, something very similar. CanJS, I think, does a really good job of straddling with its observables the functional reactive programming world of like event streams and what React is big on, and things like Elm, right? Where you kind of have your state or source state, and then everything is derived from that through functional programming or through event streams. That's one kind of model. And then there's the object-oriented model where it's nice. I can create a pagination kind of object with methods on it that has state with it. And you can call methods like, can you go to the next page, or go to the next page, or what would the offset and limit be derived from which page you're on? CanJS's observables, I think, are a good middle ground between those approaches, because it allows you to, if I have, take paginate, for example, if I have a limited offset as the state of kind of where my pagination is, I can easily derive values from that to say, oh, can I go to the next page given my limit, offset, and count? Can I go backwards? Am I at the end of the full set? Or, what is the next page number? Things like derived from your source values, you can take those and drive other values. But you're building those, you can build your own custom observables. So it bridges both worlds, because you can derive those custom values, but you're deriving them within the context of an object-oriented object. So that's something that is understandable by user or by other people who want to use whatever your module's producing. Think of it as I think sometimes when people are in the RxJS and event streams world, is the APIs that those things end up producing, those other streams, they're not easily consumable because people like objects. They can reason about them easily. But it's great because of how it manages state. Everything's derived from your source state. What I'm trying to say about CanJS is it kind of bridges those worlds, is you can derive observable properties and make your methods reach in and change state. So you can have nice APIs and derive values at the same time.
So just quick, concrete example, you were talking about pagination. Mm-hmm. And so just give me the 2-sentence version of how a blog with pagination type model goes into what you were just saying. I just need to hear it in a short version one more time to fully grasp.
Okay. If there was pagination on a blog, I'm going to create a pagination observable. And the only values that really matter in your pagination observable, really the state of your pagination, is a limit and offset, if you will. The offset and maybe the count of total number of blog posts. But
so what's the derivative value in this case?
Derivative values might be what is the page number, right? Which would be your offset divided by your limit. So if your offset was 60, but your limit was 20, well, then you're on page 3.
Okay.
Or can you go to the next page? Or can you go to the previous page?
And so you can observe the derivative values as well as the values, is what you were saying.
Yes. And you can also change the derivative values, and that will go and flow into the source values. So I could say change the page to 5, and you can wire it so it'll update the source values.
Okay.
And the other thing, which I think it does really well, is handles memory leaks really nicely. If you've used event streams, you've got to kill them if a person goes from one page to another page, stop the whole chain of observability. DoneJS is able to infer, compose computes with other computes and know, hey, this compute cares about this other kind of, you could think of it as event stream caring about another event stream, and it can flow that whole chain. So once there's no listeners on kind of the end of the derivation, all of the listeners will be kind of torn down all the way back up until to the source state. So all memory is cleared.
So at the risk of going down the rabbit hole, how do you prevent loop issues where a thing depends on itself? Because when I first started with Angular, I hit into that problem day one, because I didn't understand well enough the nature of observables. Is that something that happens here too? So yes, that can definitely happen. We have a batching thing that happens internally. So you could still, other than kind of letting because there's we can detect if something is observed on itself, but we only do it for very direct cases. We can't do it for huge cycles. We maybe could, but we only warn in the small case where it's you can think of it as when it's very clear that you're binding to yourself, we can identify that and let the user know. But
For the most part, it's not something that, at least on, the 2000 issues that we've kind of seen, that hasn't been something where people experience too much in CanJS. Maybe also because events are synchronous in CanJS and it's not dirty checking based like it is in Angular. It's the observables produce their own events immediately on a change. So maybe spotting and identifying and resolving those issues is a little bit easier with CanJS because you can walk back and see what produced this change? Oh, I can synchronously, in the call stack, walk up and see, it was the same thing that's, listening, same property is changing itself. Oh, that's maybe easier to identify because everything's synchronous.
Okay, that makes sense.
So JavaScript MVC, right? That was your sort of first version, and now this CanJS, DoneJS is sort of version 2, right? Mm-hmm. And you said that you were doing MVC with version 1 with JavaScript MVC, and now you've been talking about using MVVM. Why the change? And well, that's kind of it. Why the change?
Because MVC isn't even though I wrote JavaScript MVC, how to practically apply MVC in all cases still isn't even clear to me. I think there's just a ton of ambiguity on what is really a view in MVC can often be not clear, where in MVVM, I think it's and kind of this observable track where you take where you're writing all of your business rules and logic in this unit testable observable that is independent of the DOM completely. That's just so much a better method. Like I can create a paginate view model, if you will, call those methods on it that derive from the source state or change the first source state totally independently of the DOM. And so I think just view models encourage that behavior a lot more. It's more clear what belongs where as well.
I gotcha. I kind of feel like that MVC was one of those things, much like the theory of relativity, when Einstein was asked that the reporter says, I understand only two people in the world really understand the theory of relativity. And Einstein says, well, I can't think of who the other person is. I don't know the accuracy of that anecdote, but yeah, MVC was one of those things that everybody talked about, but every implementation was significantly different.
And that's why I asked the question about the MVVM, because I feel like it's the same story again. Like all these acronyms, like they don't mean anything. You have to understand what the person interpreted it as.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think MVVM and Model View Presenter MVP and a lot of these others were initially called MVC, and then it became apparent that what you had there, the model was pretty clear-cut what its job was, the view was pretty clear-cut what its job was, but the whatever the other thing was functioned differently enough to where it didn't make sense to call it a controller, and so we came up with other terms like a view model, which is tightly tied to the behavior and performance of your view, or the presenter, which isn't as tightly tied and just provides information to the entire view or things like that. And but yeah, the definitions are still fuzzy. I think you're right.
My question is, I feel like more and more people are going towards Flux. So why do you think that MVVM is still a good option as opposed to just using Flux?
So I think Flux trades reasonability for composability a little bit. In my experience, and we're building a React app, React and Flux, and well, I shouldn't say it's really Flux, because everything has to go through that main highest level component, or a lot of things end up going through that. It makes that kind of a central linchpin of pretty much all application behavior, which, make that file can grow really, really big. Where when you have observables, so React is kind of forced into this because of how it works. And I think just frameworks in general, they're all trying to solve the observability or state change, and then how do you reflect a state change in different ways. They all have different ways of doing it. But React's way with diffing and no observables and things like that, it ends up forcing that main component to grow really big, where something like MVVM with observables, you get one way of calling it, if we're bringing up the physics, is kind of like spooky action at a distance, where, the same instance of a to-do is in these two different components, and one can change and then the other one would just know about it without kind of having to propagate that event all the way up to some main component and then have the component kind of reset the state all the way down. They can find side channels to set up communication with this data. Now, that makes it so, this is one of the big things I think that I like about DoneJS and the way that you build things is it's all based around that modlet idea, whether you like the name or not, is that everything should kind of be self-contained and built to work on its own. And that, in my opinion, is much easier when you have observables and you're expecting kind of the same instance and one thing can change in one component and it'll just change if the same instance is somewhere else without having to have a parent component orchestrate that. It's kind of like Flux and stuff like that can sometimes be a leaky abstraction, I think, where you know, to like prevent a React from updating itself, you have to kind of like export some ID to let React know what's the key so it doesn't, you know, re-update, so it doesn't kind of recreate that same kind of component in the view model. There's issues like that Flux creates. Now, I shouldn't say like the idea, that's what I'm saying. I think the idea of what Flux and Elm and all of those things are doing, where you have, and functional reactive programming, where you kind of have your state and your application is in some ways just a mathematical reflection of your state. It's a really, really solid, strong idea. I think DoneJS does a good job of being a hybrid of those approaches, but that's kind of the problem I see with Flux. I don't know if any of that makes sense. Hopefully
No, that did.
It's kind of like a big meatball in what I would say is not spaghetti, but it's like it's like a meatball in the middle of straight uncooked spaghetti that you can easily see the lines coming out of that meatball in React, or Flux, I should say. So it's trade-off. I've seen what people have to do with those state stores when they want to start kind of combining and cross-communicating state across different parts of the application. It can get a little strange. So let's assume for a moment that I want to convince you to use DoneJS and CanJS. Ask the questions that would help me convince you.
Well, that's kind of what I've been doing anyway.
Oh, okay.
Not me.
You?
I haven't been asking those questions at all. My question is, does it look really good in a to-do app? Because that's all that convinces me and anybody to use a framework, is how good it looks in a to-do app.
Who else is using it? No.
Right. No, I think if you want to ask that question, I think there's a good question to relate to that. One of the things that I think we hear a lot from the React community, the Elm community, the Redux community, and we've been hearing the same thing from the functional reactive programming community for a long time, is it's a ton easier to maintain these applications as they get, you know, months, years down the line in the maintenance mode where we're not building it anymore. And it's not the same guys who've written 95% of the code that are still writing, but as new people come on and new people have to just maintain the existing app, that those apps are very easy to maintain and easier than your typical OO app. So can you talk maybe a little bit about that, about CanJS and how that relates?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see how that really looks in practice because all of these things are so new. I think that the hardest thing is really when you transition someone new on a project, how quickly they can understand it. I don't know. It's hard for me. This is a hard thing because I don't know how I know this is something that people kind of, in my opinion, it's one of these things that they're just saying and people are kind of taking for granted because I guess I haven't been exposed to the real evidence of this. The famous kind of Flux or React video where they're like, oh, the count, we're keeping track of the count. That's something that totally works very similar in a CanJS application, is that your count is derived or number of, what is it called? The count of unread messages is derived from these other source state values. And in the case of CanJS, you have observables that derive that value. And then, whenever the source changes, the values update themselves automatically. So I don't know. I guess I haven't been presented by the evidence where it actually deviates that much. The only place that I can see it is maybe with two-way bindings, is that where you're getting that spooky action at a distance where, well, this has its kind of its own value and the parent can have a different value. But in CanJS, you can get very easily set one directional bindings and events going up. So you can switch to that. I guess it doesn't enforce it, but two-way, I guess, two-way bindings. Like I said, that spooky action at distance can be very nice, I think, for composability, where I can say, like, here's a paginate model, and this can use that paginate model, and this other type of widget can all use that exact same paginate instance and cross-communicate with it. And they don't have to all build their own version of, I guess, an example with React and Flux I've seen is, like, if you have something like paginate, you have those derived values. You kind of derive them and then add them to the object and then pass that all around everywhere. If you know what I'm talking about, like, can you go to the next page? That's a property that kind of gets added to your paginate object and then passed to all of these different widgets. It kind of feels, I don't know, you do very similar stuff with CanJS. So I don't know, maybe you guys can illuminate me with more of the rationale behind this.
I think one of the reasons that people say those sorts of things has to do with the way the actions work in the single direction one-way data flow. Is you have these actions, this nice list of actions, so everything runs through one place, so the state can't mutate itself while it's trying to render out. And also, I think another reason probably is because you also tend to get this nice list of, here's all the valid states in your app.
Yes.
Or valid actions, I guess, is really what I'm talking about. They're not valid states, but here's all the valid actions in your app. And so when for somebody new that comes on, it's very easy to go through and see, this is everything that the app does. And for maintenance, when it's time to, I want to make a change and how some functionality works, I know exactly how this functionality flows because it all comes through here. So it's a lot easier to avoid the problem where I touch something over here, but in this far corner of the app, it breaks. Something
yeah, and I think, I would say that, that you could still do that stuff with CanJS because it has one-way bindings and you can propagate events back up to the parent that it can listen for and update itself as the only source of truth. And I guess if enforcement of that is what you need, then that's, CanJS won't provide that. But I guess in a big apps, I don't see the parent knowing and being the end all be all of everything and having to have exporting, events really to connect to the parent as the way that, I kind of want to build in multi-page apps. Like, think about it like you've got a single page application that represents multiple pages. Each of those pages should really, in general, should have its own state. And does it really need to communicate that ever up to the parent? That's really more connected to the state that's implied by the URL. I know you can have substates and components, and then you wouldn't propagate the state for just that page up to the parent. I guess I just don't see it as, I don't know. You could do things with CanJS if you want, or you can just use two-way routing and then the value, or two-way binding, and then the value, you don't have to set create it. You just change your value, and then you know that the parent's value is going to change.
Okay. So your opinion is more along the lines of you not necessarily thematically agree with all of that, that you could still write your app to be maintainable. CanJS and DoneJS, they enable that sort of thing, but the restriction of it isn't necessarily a required thing.
Yeah, I guess it's a lot of boilerplate, right? To have to dispatch an event, and then really a lot of times all that event is doing is calling an action that updates the root state, where instead you could just change your state, like, because it's connected to the root state, and just change that value, and then it's done.
That's a very common complaint among Flux and Redux users.
Yeah, so that's what two-way binding provides. Is just like, well, I can just change it. So I guess I would just say I don't know. This is such a it would depend on the situation, right? Like in a lot of apps that you get more transparency probably by always going up to this source state. But at some point, the app might get big enough where that becomes, like I said, that big meatball. That thing grows and grows and grows with methods and just to listen to the bindings and then call a state where all of the children could effectively be doing that themselves. Very good question.
So what about app size with CanJS? How big have apps gotten with this so far?
So I guess one thing to talk about is when you talk about DoneJS is, built with CanJS is the big part. So if you're talking about apps built with DoneJS, there probably aren't too many yet because it's only been out since November. But really, if you're talking about things built with CanJS and SteelJS, the dependency management part, we've built some enormous, 500 megabyte gzipped and minified apps. With not the whole, we obviously don't make that the production JS. We have one really cool thing. All the Webpack folks who might be checking this out, love Webpack or JSPM. Check out SteelJS for its dependency management. It's very similar to those, but two benefits. The first is it has a really nice high performance bundler that adds an additional step compared to like the Webpack bundler, and it doesn't have to run on the file system to load an application. It's kind of like require.js, where it can do everything in the client, which makes building demo pages or individual test pages much easier because you don't have to like set up a build for those pages. But so yeah, huge, 500 megabytes gzipped. I don't know, hundreds of files. I mean, we've been building stuff on this technology for 8 years. Unfortunately, the most high profile website that's been built with it, I can talk about. Store.apple is built with CanJS because someone posted that on Reddit, so I'm allowed to talk about it. Hooray.
I did kind of have a question about this. So if I'm kind of, as a newer person, deciding what I want to learn, I'm trying to pick something where I have to learn as little about the specific API as possible, and I can just rely on as much of just plain JavaScript as possible. So how does this fit into that? Like, would I be able to rely on just knowing a lot about JavaScript, or am I going to have to learn a lot of things about Can and Done?
So depends. That is a concern for us right now. That's one of the best things that I think React got right, was making templates kind of feel like JavaScript as much as possible. And it's actually something we have in CanJS, but it's kind of deprecated. It's old embedded JS templates, which were kind of, you would write out JavaScript. You would have the biggest hurdle that you would have to learn, I think, is handlebars, which is what its template engine is right now. We're actually right now we're working on Levi's.com it's using CanJS observables, which are really its best part, with React's templating engine. And we're going to have that as like a plugin to DoneJS. We're also planning on making a version of our templates that go back to using JavaScript instead of handlebars type templating. But if you understand handlebars, you should be fine.
All right. Well, if people want to go check out CanJS or DoneJS and find out a little bit more about what they're about, where should they go?
They should go to DoneJS.com, check out the features page, and then or a local meetup in your area. I've been going to a lot of meetups lately, so I might hit your town pretty soon. So just look out for it.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's go ahead and get to the picks. AJ, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yes. So I've got a couple of good picks this week. In case you were not aware, Taylor Swift albums are like Pokemon. You got to catch them all. And my sister pointed out to me that there was a limited edition album that very few people have that you might not be aware of. I really can't pick it because I haven't listened to it, but it's called Beautiful Eyes. And it's just like alternate versions of songs that are on other albums. I don't know if there's any songs that are specific only to that album, but I'm going to pick that because I didn't know about it. And now I do. And now you do. And if you're a Swiftie, then you can feel more complete.
AJ, Taylor Swift, she's one of those weird artists that doesn't stream her music, right? You actually have to like go somewhere and pay money for just one album.
God bless her. God bless her for standing up, for owning something and actually like having it in your hand.
Uh-huh.
So I am actually...
God bless her with none of my money.
Well, he wasn't blessing her with any of your money before, was he? So
sure, when she was streaming, he was getting some of it. Now she's getting none of it.
Oh, I hate streaming. I hate this whole. Just one day
buy it and get a digital copy, right?
Yeah, digital copy is great. Digital copy is absolutely awesome. But I'll post an article. I got to go find the link, but it's an article about what happens when Amazon videos die. And, we've already seen this kind of stuff happen before, like when they took all the Disney movies off and inevitably it's going to happen. Like somebody's going to change the policy and all those, thousands of dollars that you've spent on things that you think you own, you're going to find out that you really don't have and they're just going to be unavailable and you're going to get oh, sorry, we changed our policy one day. So I'm all about like, if you have it in your hands, you own it.
I'm just renting the music, and I love it. I get to rent every music. I'm renting it all.
And
I don't want it.
And that's what YouTube's for. So, or Spotify or Pandora, you get it all for free and never have it and only have it available when you have internet connectivity. And that is great for people that are super techie. And anyway, but leaving that rant, I'm also going to pick Protodome. That is a band. They have stuff available on Bandcamp, and you can choose to pay nothing and get it, or you can choose to pay something. The song that I really like is called This Heart Has Too Many Broken Pieces, and I can't remember which album it's on right now, but it's chiptune music or video game music. So if you love that stuff, you'll love it. I'm also going to pick City Libraries because they all have websites and they have an event calendar on them, and you'll find out that there's cool stuff like adult coloring book classes and adult story time with professional storytellers and
AJ, that explains a lot.
No, I'm gonna start going to the library more. Well, I realized, so this is what happened last year for my Facebook friend year in review. Like Facebook was like, here's you, and it shows some pictures of me, and then it's like, here's you with your friends, and it showed my mom and my sister, and then it was like, here's things you've done, and it was like me standing still. And I have a cool life, okay? I have fun, and I don't care what Facebook says. I do too have friends.
We're programmers. There should just be a picture of the computer. That's my friend.
But so I decided this year I'm actually going to try to go do things more things, because I did things last year. I did, but I'm going to try to do more things and like take pictures and stuff. And so I've been looking at like city event calendars and like free stuff and paid stuff and whatever. And I found the city library calendars to be very helpful. And then lastly, I will pick The Crucible of Doubt, which is a book that has been mind-blowing in my personal rediscovery of faith that I'm going through right now. And it's by the same authors of the book that I picked last time, The God Who Weeps.
All right, Amy, do you have some picks for us?
I do. I have a fun one and a serious one. I'm going to start with the serious one. So the serious one, somebody sent me over a link in the Elm Slack channel, but it is a site called learnxandYminutes.com, and it has a ton of different programming languages on there, and it just kind of runs through the syntax and stuff. So for things like Elm, where this is like something that's very, very different than any language I've ever learned before. So I actually found this to be really, really helpful, especially for Elm. So if you are interested in Elm, check that out. You could also check it out for other languages, although I can't say anything about those because I haven't looked at them yet. My fun pick is something called Which Cat is Your JavaScript Framework? Unfortunately, I don't see can or done on here, but it's still pretty fun. They have all the regular players in here. So if you are in for like a little joke or something, you can check that out. That's it for me this week.
All right, Joe, what are your picks?
Okay. Well, I want to start off with a tweet that John Papa tweeted recently. And it was basically about having manners on social media, right? And not treating social media differently than you would treat a real life interaction. I'll post the tweet itself, the link to it. But basically the point was, and it was actually, he tweeted this actually after he and I had a conversation about somebody who had criticized one of my courses on social media over Twitter, I think. And the criticism was completely valid. Of course, everybody's work is subject to imperfection. And what I had done wasn't necessarily perfect, and by his opinion, he didn't like it, which is fine. But the way that he made the comment was really kind of like in poor taste, and something you would never say to a person's face unless maybe you were a sociopath. But because it was on social media, it's something more common, the type of thing that we see. And so that's going to be my pick, is just being a good citizen over social media and treating social media the same way that you would treat real life interactions. So that's gonna be my only pick this week.
Yeah, I want to plus one that one on email as well. I got an email when I sent around an email saying, "Hey, I'm going to be in Amsterdam, so if you're from there or going to be there, I'd like to meet up and hang out." I got an email, and it was, "Why the F are you emailing this to me?" And I emailed him back and said, "I don't know who's in Amsterdam," so I let everybody know and figured the people who didn't care wouldn't bother him. Yeah, and I got an email back just saying, "Yeah, I was drunk that night, and I'm real sorry." And a lot of times we just don't think about it. We're kind of in some headspace, either assisted by some drug or not, and or lack of sleep. And so +1 on that, and think doubly as hard if you're sort of emotionally compromised.
Right. Well, you never know. It's just not a good way to treat life. There's far too many interactions that it's hard enough when you're talking about these impersonal interactions to just give the wrong impression anyway, to say something that you don't necessarily mean. But add on to that the anonymity and the temptation to just say what you feel without thinking it through and saying, well, would I say this to a real person that was sitting in front of me, and not like filtering it out, right? And it just becomes a big habit. You never know who you're talking to and how your comments may affect both your life and their life, right? So I think it's just always better to act on social media the way you would act in person.
Yep. Amy,
I know tons of people.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say to Joe, for what it's worth, everyone that I talk to absolutely loves your course on testing site.
Well, thank you, Amy.
You got to stop talking to his mom.
Oh no, these aren't his mom.
Yeah, when Amy had her Facebook year in review, here's your friends. It was my mom. Here's things you've done, and she was chatting with my mom.
Yeah.
That's it.
All right, I've got a couple of picks. These are more along the marketing line of picks. I recently set up a set of emails. It is the top 10 episodes of JavaScript Jabber ever, at least to date as of the beginning of this year. Anyway, it was kind of fun to compile, but I'm using a few tools to get it out there so people can use it or to get to the emails. So the first one is SumoMe at sumome.com. And it's a tool that allows you to put marketing tools on your website. So if you go to javascriptjabber.com, it'll actually slide down with a full screen place where you can put your email address to get it. It only does it once. I figured that's not too awful intrusive, but then if people want it, they can get it, and it's real easy to find. The other tool I'm using there is Drip. That's at getdrip.com, and it's a terrific email marketing tool that I've probably picked on the show before, and I'm super, super happy about. I also went to a game night earlier this month and played a couple of new games that were fun. The first one was called Seven Wonders, and it's kind of hard to explain what it is. It's a rather involved game, but it was a ton of fun. And it's one of those games where you can kind of see what everybody's doing, and you can see how they're trying to win the game, but you don't really know who won until the end. And sometimes you're a little surprised, oh, you stacked that up. But effectively, you build certain resources and use those resources to get other resources that count toward victory points. The other game we played was called Shadow Hunters. It's kind of werewolf with life points, and it also has different cards that are like weapons or give you some special ability this way or that, and that's also just a ton of fun. So I'm going to pick both of those. And finally, I'm just picking a ton today. 2 of my book series that I've been listening to on Audible came out with new books. The first one is The Reckoners by Brandon Sanderson. The third book, Calamity, just came out, and I'm really itching to read that one.
You haven't started it yet?
Not yet. I want to go back and listen to the other books again.
I went down to the pre-release and got a signed copy. I'm such a geek.
I didn't know he was doing that.
Yep.
That would have been fun. The other one is the Iron Druid Chronicles by Kevin Hearn, and the book Staked came out last week. So I picked that up on Audible as well. I just finally finished listening to all the books that lead up to it. I didn't listen to there are like a couple of hour and a half long short story form parts of the story that I didn't go back and listen to again. But yeah, I'm in the middle of Staked right now because that's the one that I ran across first. So I'm super excited for that. That came out last month. And so I'm really enjoying those. So I'm going to pick those as well. Justin, what are your picks?
So my first pick is the BB-8 Sphero, which is like a little remote controlled BB-8. That is amazing for lazily keeping crawling babies entertained, which I have one of those. And then the next pick is something that I recommend to everybody who likes science fiction, which is the Hyperion Cantos. It's a series of 4 books written by Dan Simmons. If you like crazy science fiction fantasy and like, in some ways, just being exposed to things that I wasn't exposed to, the writings of John Keats before, I highly encourage you to pick up the audiobook or the real book. I'm reading it now for maybe like the 10th time. Highly encourage people to check that out.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up the show. Thank you again for coming, Justin, and giving people an opportunity to kind of mentally explore this particular topic in those libraries.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll wrap this up, and we'll catch you all next week. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Do you wish you could be part of the discussion on JavaScript Jabber? Do you have a burning question for one of our guests? Now you can join the action at our membership forum. You can sign up at javascriptjabber.com/jabber, and there you can join discussions with the regular panelists and our guests.